Hello, folks. I'd like to take a bird's eye view of where we have been in the book of Jeremiah. In chapter 1, we talked about the call of Jeremiah and the two visions, the almond tree and the boiling pot. But from chapter 2 through chapter 25, we've been talking about the divine judgment on Judah and Jerusalem. If you think that Jeremiah has been repetitive in these chapters, well, he has been. That's been the theme of this major section. As we begin chapter 26, we are entering a new section. That will be through chapter 29, and it will be about Jeremiah's controversy with the false prophets. Now, there are two passages in our readings over chapters 24 and 25 that I'd like to talk about with you today very briefly. In chapter 24, we read about the vision of the two baskets of figs. The historical background of this vision is the first deportation of the people in 597 BC. The good figs in our story are identified as those exiles who are already in Babylon. The ones who remain in the land, they will perish. They are the bad figs. There is the promise that the good figs will return to the land in chapter 24 and verse 6. And I want to read that verse for you just very briefly. I will set my eyes upon them for good, and I will bring them back to this land. I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not pluck them up. Doesn't that sound like Jeremiah's commission in chapter 1 and verse 10? And then listen to verse 7. I will give them a heart to know that I am the Lord, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God, for they shall return to me with their whole heart. Now, a few things about that passage, verse 7, that I want to talk about very briefly. And the first is God's promise to give them a new heart. Aren't we grateful today that God is in the business of heart renewal? That He actually helps us to renew our hearts when the need is there. And I like the fact, too, that this restoration in verse 7 comes after the judgment of God. That is, after these people have been exiled to the land of Babylon. Judgment appears to be the very means by which the new beginning of God's people was to be achieved. And if we would apply that thought to our lives, what would we say? Something like this, perhaps? That sometimes we must experience God's judgment. Sometimes we must experience pain and suffering before we see better days. And God's plan, of course, is that these people return to the land and return to Him with their whole heart. Which reminds us that this, of course, is what God is looking for in us, our total commitment. With a whole heart, we want to love our God. And then I want to refer to chapter 25 and verse 9, where God refers to King Nebuchadnezzar as His servant. Now, isn't that interesting? Jeremiah is certainly saying that God is going to use King Nebuchadnezzar as His instrument to inflict punishment upon His people. And what that tells me is that God is able to use even those who don't worship Him as His instruments to carry out and fulfill His plans. And I'm sure that as you read through that verse and those verses, you thought probably of the sovereignty of God, didn't you? How that God is over all the world, and that He will accomplish His purposes one way or another, and that our God is even able to use those who don't respect Him and don't honor Him and don't worship Him to carry out His plans. What a God we serve. Now, a brief preview of chapter 26. As I said earlier, in chapter 26 we're beginning a new section, Jeremiah's condemnation of the false prophets. And in chapter 26, we're going to read about Jeremiah's sermon in the temple and its consequences. Just amazing. Enjoy your reading and meditation on Jeremiah, and I'll see you again in just a very few short days. God bless.